Hey friends, Miss Julia here again, and I also have the lovely Josie who is going to go on our sewing journey with us today. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get to know our pattern envelope a little bit. So Josie, the good news is you already picked out a pattern, which we know is going to be our Fluffy Stuffy. And what we're going to do is we're going to open it up. You ready to open it up? So I'm going to give you the honors. You're going to take this over here. And inside the package, you're going to find a lot of paper. And that paper is going to tell us all the information that we need to actually put our Fluffy Stuffy together. All right, so let's take a closer look. All right, guys, so Josie has opened up our pattern here and she has taken out our guide sheets. Our guide sheets are actually the thicker paper that are inside the pattern envelope. And like guide sheet sounds, it's going to guide us through the process of sewing our Fluffy Stuffy. So what I want to do is just explain some of the parts that we're going to be looking at so that you will have a good understanding. The first thing you should know is you should have three guide sheets when you open up your package. The first guide sheet you will find on here holds our diagram and practice sheets. This page is actually not numbered, so you will notice that there's nothing up in the corners, and when you flip it over, it is blank because we will be using this guide sheet. Josie, I'm going to have you take this guide sheet and put it off to the side. Where we really start to get into our instructions is on page 3. You'll notice at the top right-hand corner, you'll see 3 of 6, because that is telling us how many pages we have in our guide sheet packet, which is 6 pages, and we're on page 3. So you have to remember we're going to be using the front and backs of the guide sheet. So when I flip this over, like so, you will find 4 of 6, and so on and so forth. Now I'm going to flip us back to page 3 over here, and we're going to come to the very top section, which really is our introduction on how to handle this pattern. Okay guys, we're going to start here on page 3 in the first section of the instructions, and we're going to start on step 1 because that's a lovely place to start. So here we are, step 1, watching videos. And that's what we're doing. We're watching videos if you're watching me right now. And what it's going to do is it's going to bring you through the entire process of putting together your Fluffy Stuffy. So just hang in there and be patient. The other thing I'll mention is that we have a link on our website that you can go to see our videos and get more assistance if you need help with things like your sewing machine or how to thread or general instructions on other sewing machine projects. Step 2 is reading the instructions. Go figure, right? So what we're going to do is we recommend that you read the instructions and watch the videos, one step at a time. This way you're only taking it one step at a time, just like a journey. Every journey begins with one step. All right, helpful things to know in this pattern. So one of the things you're going to notice in these patterns is that you'll see words in bold, and then you'll see a thinking emoji after the words. That means it's going to be an important word that you will want to understand so that you can successfully put your pattern together. If you have questions, as we mentioned in the very beginning, you can email us at support@thehandworkstudio.com. The other important thing is to make sure you have all your materials. Just like if you're cooking, you want to make sure you have your ingredients. So when looking at the back of your pattern, you will have your list of supplies needed with check boxes. Use those check boxes to make sure you have all your materials. The other really important aspect of making sure you can sew successfully is a flat surface to work on. We here have a large, lovely table. However, not everybody has a tabletop surface. You're also welcome to use the floor. Preferably a clean floor is helpful, but floors and tabletops are great places to be able to sew. Nothing fancy. All right, so now that you have all your materials, you have a good space to work, now you have to talk about safety. All right, so Josie, knowing that this is going to be one of your first time sewing, you probably have a sense that we need to think about safety to make sure we end up intact by the end of our sewing project. So in this grayed out section here on our guide sheet, you'll notice we mentioned some safety tips. Some of these things might be obvious, but we want to make sure everyone has a good understanding. One of the things we always talk about in our studio is to keep your shoes on when working. The reason why, Josie, can you guess why we might want to keep our shoes on? Well, I will tell you from experience, keep your shoes on when working so you don't accidentally step on anything sharp. We will be using pins, needles, and scissors in this process. The other thing we want to note is remain seated when sewing. So one of the things people might do is stand while they sew, but that can actually throw off your line of vision and you might not have a good sense of where your hands need to be. So we recommend remaining seated when sewing. And we also mentioned the sharp things that we'll be using. Do you remember?
Needles and pins.
Needles, pins, and some scissors. So that means when you're working with them to always know where they are. Try to keep them contained. The other thing about scissors is we know not to throw them across the room, right? So when we want to use our scissors, we want to make sure they're being passed correctly if you need to pass them to somebody, or make sure that they're on the surface when you're not being used, or make sure you're not cutting ever on your lap. I've seen kids do that before. They end up making shorts out of their pants. All right, and the other thing that we're going to be using is an iron, and an iron can get hot. So with anything hot, we want to make sure we have a sense of where it's going to be located. Watch out for the cords on the iron and also the surface on the bottom of the iron, never want to touch. And that should keep us safe while we're sewing. Okay, Josie, we are going to get this Fluffy Stuffy party started. So we have our pattern tissue here since you pulled it out of our envelope. And like the words pattern tissue sound, it's actually very tissue papery feeling if you want to give it a feel. So that means it needs to be pretty, you need to be pretty gentle when you open it up, okay? And what you're going to unfold when you open it up is all your pattern pieces with their information on it. So I'm going to have you go ahead and start unfolding our pattern tissue. Okay, Josie and I have opened up our pattern tissue and we are removing the second layer. So Josie, I'm just going to have you put that off to the side since it's only 2 of us today. We don't have the full party. And I just want you guys to take a closer look at what we have on the pattern tissue. Since you can see we have lots of words and lines. The first thing I want to point out is these dark outlines around our kitty squares. The dark outlines are to show you sections. So what we have in each section is a stuffy front. We have a stuffy back. I'm going to just move this towards us since it's a large piece of tissue. And you'll notice that we have some little small pieces that are inner ear, our nose, our tongue, and our eyeball. And in this section we have a tail, ear, eye, collar, and whiskers. And so those are all what we call the kitty or the stuffy details that will go on to our stuffy front and our stuffy back pieces. So my recommendation is the first thing you should do is we're going to cut out the section that you're going to use. Since you're making one stuffy today, we're going to cut out this one section. So I'm going to give you a pair of scissors and I'm going to scoot this section. I always like to start on the end so you don't have to kind of cut into the middle. And we're just going to follow that dark outline, which is really it's a cutting line. All right. All right, Josie, now that we cut our section apart, we are going to cut out our individual pieces. But I just want to make note before we move off our large piece of pattern tissue over here that there are some symbols that you'll find on your pattern tissue that will tell you some important information. There's the grain line that we talked about when we discussed fabric, and you'll see that the grain line shows up on our Fluffy Stuffy front, our stuffy back, and not on our other pieces. We also have pictures of something called notches, which you will find on, that actually you won't find on this pattern. And we have cutting lines, which we already looked at because we cut our lines to cut our section out. But you'll notice there's cutting lines around each of the stuffy pieces and the details. And you will also notice that there's some dots on our sheet as well, which are going to be place markers. And you'll notice that you can see outlines where the eyes, the whiskers, the mouth, and the nose are going to go. So these are all going to be important pieces as we put our stuffy, fluffy kitty together. Okay? So now what I'm going to have you do is we're going to put the extra pattern tissue off to the side. We're going to bring our stuffy front pieces facing you, and now we're going to cut out the individual pieces, okay? So just follow the cutting lines. You're going to cut out all of the sections. Excellent, Josie. You have cut out our stuffy front, our stuffy back, and our stuffy details over here. So you should have 4 pieces, pattern pieces, that are going to be used to sew your fluffy stuffy together. So what I need you actually to do is we're going to cut into the details. You're going to need to cut out the inner ear, the nose, and the eyeball, and the tongue, which are really tiny pieces. So I do recommend that you take your time with these. And if you have like a little Ziploc bag, maybe if you're not using them all at once, you can put them in a small Ziploc bag just to keep them contained so you don't lose them. So I'm going to have you go ahead and start cutting out some of our stuffy details. And we're going to go ahead over to this one and we'll cut that. We'll cut the tail out. We'll start with the tail. All right, Josie, I know your hand must be tired. You got all your stuffy details cut out. So they're all individual pieces, and you'll notice that they actually will match up to the outlines on our other pattern tissue pieces. So eventually they are going to get placed on our stuffies, like so. It's just giving you guys an idea of what's going to happen. So I do have my little Ziploc here, or any other kind of little baggie to contain it. You can just pop them in there. So I'll have you go ahead and do that. We're not going to be using these right now, so just be careful. If you need to gently fold them up, that's fine. And put them off to the side. Sometimes the wind will blow them away, so you don't want that to happen. And what we're going to do now is we're going to get ready to put our stuffy front and back pieces on your fabric that you picked out. Okay? All right, Josie, I love the fabric you picked for your fluffy stuffy. You went to the fabric store and you had about 1/2 yard of your cotton fabric picked out. This is a flannel in this nice purple color. And you'll notice that, like we discussed about our fabric earlier, it is on the fold. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to unfold it. So here is our selvage edges that we discussed earlier. This is going to be important when we lay out our pattern. But we're going to unfold this now so we do not have a fold, like so. And we're going to just flip it. So if you remember, there's a right side and a wrong side. You notice there's no purple on the side, so this will be the wrong side. And we are going to flip it so the right side of the fabric is facing up. I always like to think of it as the pretty side, the one you want to see. So when you have the right side of the fabric facing up, we're going to make sure we have the selvage edges really kind of parallel to our table. So if you remember, parallel is our lines going in the same direction, so the top of the table and the selvage edges are now parallel. And what we're going to do is take our stuffy, fluffy pattern tissue pieces, our front and back, and put it onto our fabric. So I'm going to, doesn't really matter which one you take since they're really both about the same size. You just want to make sure they're going to be laid out correctly. So if you notice, our arrow on here is talking about our straight grain. So we need to make sure our arrow is now going parallel with our selvage. And we're going to get it pretty close to the edge, but you don't want to really capture the selvage. That might be a little funky if you notice the edges are a little, they feel a little different than the rest of your pattern. There you go. Okay, so we have our stuffy front in the right spot, and why don't you go ahead, Josie, and we're going to go ahead and lay out our stuffy back right next door with like just a tiny bit of space just so we can get our scissors through there, like so. And then we need something to attach it to our fabric. Any idea what you might want to use?
Pins.
Yeah, pins, exactly. So pins are just going to temporarily hold the pattern tissue to our fabric so it doesn't blow away. Okay, so let's get our pins out. Okay, so like we were just saying, Josie has our pin cushion over here, which is full of pins. And what we're going to do is put the pins into the fabric. And the way we're going to do that, I like to put the pins actually on top. If the pattern tissue is big enough, it adds a little weight to it so it doesn't move around as we're pinning. And you're going to take one pin, and we're going to pin inside. I like to kind of pin, you'll notice these dotted lines here, kind of like pin right next to those dotted lines. It's kind of a nice guide. And we need to hold the fabric, and what sometimes I do is give it a little pinch, and that way you're pushing the fabric up and pushing the pin all the way through so that it will attach it completely through the fabric. So the pin actually needs to show up on the other side of the fabric to make sure it's actually attaching itself, okay? For our next pin, I'm going to go about a hand span away from the first pin, just so they're not on top of each other. You don't really need that to hold this pattern tissue in place. I'm going to come to, right about almost the middle of our pattern tissue here. I'm going to do our little squeeze, our gentle push into the fabric, and I'm going to flip it over to make sure it went all the way through. I think we're good, right? And we're going to do our third pin, which is going to go about a hand span away. We'll do our squeeze, check it, make sure it's good. And I'm going to have you, while I'm doing this side, I'm going to have you go ahead and try our other the stuffy back, okay? All right, our stuffy front and our stuffy back are pinned down to our fabric. So what that means is we are going to cut it out of the fabric now so we can actually get the shape of what we want to sew together. And you'll notice on here that we have the cutting lines. You can still see those dark outlines along the edges. That's actually the lines you want to follow. Do not follow the dotted lines. Those are going to be your seam allowance, which we'll talk about when you go to sew. All right, so I'm going to take my scissors, and I'm a righty, so it's comfortable for me to start on this side of my stuffy front and just kind of gently snip in and follow. And it's really important to take your time with this step because you want to make sure your pieces are as close to the pattern tissue shape as possible so that your stuffy will actually look like what you want it to look like. If you start making funny cuts, sometimes your stuffy might lose some of its inches and not look as stuffy and fluffy as we want it to be. So we're just going to follow our cutting line straight on up and get both of our pieces cut out. So Josie, I'm going to have you go ahead and cut our front and our backs out of fabric. Okay, so we have our stuffy back and our stuffy front cut out of our fabric, and now we're going to get ready to cut out all of our stuffy details. So what I have here is our craft felt. So we recommended picking out a pink, really for your nose, your tongue, and those pieces that were on that little square that we cut out earlier. And we also have brown or maybe a black craft felt that you'll use for cutting out your ears and your eyes and your whiskers. And we're going to do almost the same exact thing we just did with our stuffy front and our stuffy back. We're going to take our pieces and we're going to lay them out onto our felt. Okay, so Josie, I'm going to have you help me take our pieces out of our Ziploc bag. And I'll also say if you don't have a Ziploc bag, you can use an envelope or just some sort of way to keep them contained. And remember, we have some really delicate pieces, so you can go ahead and take some of those out. We're going to lay them out on the felt. Because the felt is made of a different material, it's not woven, it's actually not going to have a selvage in the way that our cotton fabrics or our flannel fabrics will have. So we really can place our pieces anywhere we want on the craft felt, and it's not going to matter as much. However, you do want to make sure you leave yourself enough space to cut between the pieces, but making sure all your pieces at the same time fit on your craft felt. We expect that you can get 2 fluffy, stuffy details for the pink pieces on a pink piece of felt. We're using a 9x12. And really 1 piece of 9x12 craft felt for the brown pieces that we're using today, okay? So we're gonna lay our tongue out on here. We're gonna put our collar on our brown craft felt, so that can go on the bottom here. Keeping things close to the edge is always helpful. That way it's less cutting in. And remember, what do you think we're gonna have to do to hold all these pieces in place?
Pin them.
You got it. So now we're going to go ahead and pin all of our details to our craft felt. Okay? Josie, here's our pins again. And you'll notice these pieces are much tinier than they were when we cut our stuffy back and stuffy front. So we do need to be careful using these pins. It's not going to pinch as easily. So I like to just kind of hold them down to the fabric. So I'm holding the pattern tissue and I'm pushing the pin into the pattern tissue and then just kind of really pushing the pin up. So leveraging it to point up to the sky to push it in. If you are having trouble pinning these tiny pieces to your fabric, you can trace. I will say this might be an opportunity to trace your pieces if it makes it a little easier. And what that will look like is holding down your piece. We have our pen. And really almost any type of writing utensil will do to get the gist of the shape we want to cut out. And sometimes it helps to have somebody helping you with this. And so you'll notice that now we have an inner ear trace to our fabric, okay? If that's easier for somebody to do it that way, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and have you continue pinning. All right, so we have most of our detail pieces pinned. So Josie, what I'm going to have you do is actually just take a strip and cut it off so you don't need all this extra felt. You can use this again for another stuffy, or if you want to make something else out of pink felt. So no real, rhyme or reason. You just want to make sure you kind of take it away from all the excess felt that's on there. Josie, you did a great job getting all these pieces cut out. I know it was a lot of hard work, but it's going to pay off in the end when we get to actually put everything together onto our fluffy stuffy. So I'm going to have everybody leave their pattern tissue on their fabric for now. Don't unpin anything because there's just a lot of information. Like this is telling you what it actually is. The tail is the tail. The collar is the collar. The back and the front. So no unpinning just yet until we tell you to actually go ahead and unpin. One of the things we want to talk about in here for our stuffy back is and our stuffy front, there are some markings that we briefly mentioned that we need to now pay attention to. So you'll notice these little circles on the bottom. There's 2 on each stuffy back and the stuffy front, and those are called dots. And the dots are for us to understand the placement of something. For our pattern today, it's going to show us where we're going to start sewing and then stop sewing when we put our fabric together. So we're going to take a pen, and all we're going to do is push the tip of the pen through the fabric, because what we want to do is just transfer. So I'm just kind of like wiggling it around on there, just so you get the sense of where that start and stop point will need to be. And the nice thing is the pattern tells us where that needs to happen. So I'm going to just do it on here. A pen will work, a felt tip marker, a piece of, chalk will not work because it doesn't have that sharpness. So it'll be much harder to do it with a piece of chalk, but like a fabric pencil, even a colored pencil would work. But for, ease, most people have pens in their house and they can use that. So I'm going to have you try it, Josie, on the stuffy front piece over here. and then we'll show you guys what it's going to look like. So you just kind of like pierce, like poke a hole in the paper, and then wiggle it around on there so you can get that mark. And you're making a dot. And you'll find that complicated patterns will have dots as well. So it's good to know these terms and how they work. All right. Good? Awesome. So I'm just going to gently flip the paper back. I don't know if anyone can actually see that, but you can see there's now been 2 dots transferred. Voila, 2 dots transferred. Excellent. So that tells us now when we remove the pattern tissue where it's going to need to be. Everything else on here where you see these dotted lines will not matter so much for right now. Okay? So we are now done marking our pieces. Our details do not have any dots for us to do. So we are going to go ahead and unpin the pattern tissue only from our stuffy back and stuffy front. Okay? And we always recommend putting your pins back and keeping our space organized because we're about to get ready, believe it or not, to sew. You got it. All right, Josie, now that we have removed the pins and we made our dots, when we take away the pattern tissue, we want to make sure we actually know what the pieces are supposed to be. So we have what you might call painter's tape. This is excellent just because when you use it, it doesn't leave a stickiness behind. Like some masking tape or duct tape I really don't recommend just because that's extra sticky and then you might have a really sticky stuffy. Say that 5 times fast. And we're going to take 2 pieces. So I'm going to give that to you. And you can actually put that right on the table and write on it stuffy back. I'm going to do the same thing and I'm going to write stuffy front. Maybe 3 inches is all you need. Doesn't need to be exact, but you don't need 20 feet. You want to make sure it fits right on your piece of fabric. Excellent. And I'm going to go ahead and write stuffy front. Okay, so we can take off our pattern tissue. And it's nice because there's 2 of us here, so we can each take one. And I'm going to stick it right in the middle, just like that. That's what's super nice about painter's tape. It doesn't have any stickiness left on the table. Great. All right, so now our pieces are labeled, and that means we are going to get our sewing machine out. All right, Josie, so we have finally broken our sewing machine out to get ready to sew our fabric together. So the first thing we want to do is make sure everything is set up properly on the sewing machine. It's always something before we get to the real deal. So what I'm going to come to over here is our dial for our stitch length. And you'll see that the numbers on here range from 0 all the way up. And we have these S's on here to add to the different stitch length. So what we want to do on our directions, it says 2.5. So on our machine, it's like a 2 and a 3. So we're going to go right in the middle of the 2 and the 3. And we're going to make sure that we're on our straight stitch. So that for our machine is letter A, and that also shows that my needle is right in the middle. So I'm going to check. It looks like we're on the letter A. And then a good habit to have before you actually get to sewing is to run a scrap piece of fabric under the sewing machine to make sure it's actually working the way you want it to work. There's nothing worse than sewing on your project and getting all your thread jammed up or tangled and having to seam rip. So I'm going to take a piece of our scrap fabric since we had some left over when we were cutting out our stuffy front and our stuffy back. And I'm going to leave it. And we're going to put it under here, under our presser foot. And I'm going to just put my presser foot down. I'm going to turn my hand wheel so my needle is in to the fabric, and I'm going to step on the pedal. And I'm going to do my back stitch just to make sure everything's looking good. Run it under. Sounds pretty good. Sometimes your machine will make real clunky noises, and that's not good. You want to stop and check to see what's going on. So we made it to the end. I did that back stitch. I am pulling my thread out. Also, a good practice is when I cut the thread, I always make sure the thread is touching just about the back of the table. so that it's long enough and doesn't get pulled out. I know sometimes when we're teaching class, when it's cut too short, you'll constantly have to rethread your needle just because you don't have enough thread in there. So I am looking at my stitches. What do you think? I think we're looking okay. The other thing we're going to do is check on our seam allowance. So the way we're going to do our seam allowance is looking at our needle plate over here. We want to make sure we find the correct measurement. Do you see the numbers that are on the plate over here? Okay, so it's basically a mini ruler. And sometimes it's a little hard to see. I'm going to make sure the machine is off so we don't accidentally step on the pedal. And I'm going to use a pin just to try to zoom in here. But you'll notice there's a 1/2 inch notch and a little line. And that is actually the line we want to work with for our stuffy front and stuffy back. So I'm going to just take another piece of tape. Again, it doesn't need to be 20 feet long, just a couple inches to give us the idea. And this is a really nice visual. Bright blue. It's a lot easier than trying to look constantly at that little tiny line on the seam guide. So it's just marking it a little better for us. So I'm lining it up. Ooh. Make sure it's kind of sticking. There we go. There's my seam allowance, okay? I just want to quickly talk to you guys about using a seam allowance. So what we're going to do is put the edge of our fabric up against the edge of the tape. And when you put your presser foot down and when we start sewing, the seam allowance is actually going to be the stitches to the edge of the fabric, that width. And if it's too wide, so let's say we're not on the seam allowance, you see how now the edge of the fabric is no longer touching the edge of the tape? So that's a much larger seam allowance, and that means we're going to lose too many inches or millimeters really at this point on our fabric. So it's going to make our kitty much smaller, okay? If you're way over here not touching, that means it's going to be very tiny and maybe it's going to offset or you're not going to capture both layers of your fabric. So you really want to make sure you are watching when you sew the edge of your fabric to the edge of that piece of tape. So this to this. And when I sew like so, I'm going to turn my machine on and we're going to just see how it's running right against that edge. That's going to keep my 1/2 inch. I'm going to do our back stitch just for good measure. Pull it out and you can see my lines are pretty straight, about 1/2 inch, and we know that everything's going to look correct when I'm sewing my Fluffy Stuffy. Alright Josie, our machine is in order. Now we have to put our fabric together, and what that means is we're going to have our front and our back pieces again. And right now the pretty sides, the right sides, are facing up. And when we sew, this is a strange thing about sewing, we usually sew with our things sort of inside out. So if you look at your clothing, you'll notice a lot of your stitching will be found on the inside of your clothing, and that's so it's hidden. So your clothing on the outside looks nice and smooth. So what we're going to do is we're going to put right sides of the fabric together like this. And what I would love for you to help me do, Josie, is match up the edges. Really just make sure, everything is pretty even. No major overlaps, because what you don't want to do, and I'll just show you, you're not going to sew your Fluffy Stuffy like that. That's terrible. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure all the edges, all 4 corners are pretty close. Smooth it out. Excellent. And it does hide some information, so you'll remember our tape is on the inside and our dots are on the inside. But we don't really need to see them so much right now. What we're going to do is take our pins and we're going to now attach these 2 pieces together. Again, it's temporary so that when we're going to sew it on the sewing machine, it doesn't wiggle around on us, okay? So when we take our pins, if you remember, we were going sort of parallel with the edges. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have the ends of the pins sticking out over the fabric. So I'm going to pinch it again and push it through, just like that. And we're going to go a hand span apart, pinch it, and I'm going to have you do the 3 sides. So we're going to go up this side, over on that side, and down this side, and then I'm going to stop at the bottom because we need to talk about the dots. Okay? So Josie, I'm going to have you go ahead and help me. Why don't you take that side? We'll do another pinch. And I'm going to have the tops of the pins. You see the tops of the pins? They're like ball heads right here. You're going to pinch them. And just push them down. Pinch them. We're almost there. So our 3 sides, our 4th side, we are going to take our pins. I'm going to just kind of peek underneath to find our dots, okay? We're going to put a pin in each dot, okay? That's the only pins we're going to need on the bottom edge. So I'm going to just kind of put my finger there on top, and I'm going to have the sharp edge of the pin facing out now, okay? So I'm going to pinch it in the same way. You notice now the sharp edge rather than the plastic ball head at the top is facing out. We're going to do the same thing. You want to see if you can find the dot and put your finger there? So just lift it up. Perfect. And just, mark it with your finger. And then we're going to push the pin through right around that dot. All right. These pins are going to mark where we are going to start sewing and stop sewing. All right. And we are now officially ready to sew our fabric. Okay, I have brought our fabric to the sewing machine. I have put the fabric underneath the presser foot, and I'm just going to take it out for 1 second. If you notice the 2 dots, I'm starting with the one on the left hand side because that's going to allow us to go all the way around our pattern and end on the other dot properly with the direction the machine sews in. So I'm going to go ahead and line it up underneath the presser foot. I'm going to put the presser foot down. I'm also going to make sure that the edge of my fabric is close to my tape, because if you remember, that's my seam allowance. I want to make sure we're using our 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to take our pin out because we really don't want to sew with our pin. So I'm going to have you put the pin back, Josie. Another wonderful reason to have 2 people to sew with to help you keep your pins in the right place. So now I'm going to put my needle into the fabric. So it's right about where the dot would be, matched up against my seam allowance. And I'm going to get ready to sew. My stitches are in the right place, my length is right. So we're going to come forward, I'm going to turn our machine on, come forward, I stop, we're going to do our back stitch, and now we're just going to follow it right to the corner. And if you guys remember when we did this in the beginning, our practice sheets, we are now ready to pivot. So my needle is down in the fabric. I'm going to lift up the presser foot and swing it on over and make sure that I'm still pretty close to that piece of tape. I'm going to start sewing again. I'm going to get to the pin. I like to think of pins as stop signs. So right before I get to a pin, I want to stop. I'm going to take the pin out. I'm going to hand it to Ms. Josie. And we're going to go ahead and continue down our other side of our stuffy. I'm going to stop. What am I going to do?
Take out the pin.
Take out the pin, hand it over. And when I get to this next corner, Josie, I think of sewing as driving. I'm going to hand the wheel over to you. All right? So I'm going to continue just following it straight down. Make sure you're in control. If you feel like you can't keep up, just slow your sewing down by lifting your foot up a little bit on the foot pedal. We're almost there. I'm gonna get to. I really like to stop right about where my presser foot's about to hit the edge of the fabric. You know, the ends of it. If my needle's up, make sure it goes back down. And what are we gonna do? We're gonna pivot. So I'm gonna turn it. Okay. So now we're gonna go ahead and switch seats. You're going to go in the driver's seat. And I'm going to help guide you to make sure we're going to get all the way back around where we're supposed to. All right, Josie, you've taken the wheel. And when you're ready, you can go ahead. Looks like we're all set up still against our seam guide over here. We're going to keep our 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we're going to sew right until we get to our pin. There you go. Excellent. And stop. Perfect. So take that pin. I will be your assistant. There you go. Put your pin back and continue on your merry way. All right, excellent. And stop. We'll put that right back in there. All right, and remember when we get our presser foot right to about the corner, I'm going to have you stop. And stop. Perfect. So what I'm going to have you do, we're actually going to move the hand wheel once. So I'm going to have you go over to the right hand side, turn the wheel, and make sure that needle's down. Excellent, and stop. Now we're going to lift up the presser foot lever in the back. So I'm going to have you lift that up. And we're going to swing it on over. Excellent. Perfect. All right, so now we're going to come down our other long edge. And step. Great. And stop. What you always want to be doing when you're sewing is just making sure your fabric remains nice and flat. If it gets bunchy, you want to make sure you spread it out so that if you don't want to sew over any bunches, it's like a speed bump and it'll look lumpy. So that's not very good. It's not a good look for your stuffy fluffy. All right, go ahead. Great. All right, almost there. Okay. And a little bit more. And stop right there. Now you're going to move the needle down. Okay, great. And you're going to lift up your presser foot lever. We're going to swing it and back down. And we're going to sew right to our pin. And stop. And let's take our pin out and put it back in our pin cushion. And now we're going to do a back stitch, okay? This way, when we go to like flip everything out, it won't come apart. So I'm going to have you push that down really hard. And step on the pedal. And stop. And let go. And come forward. And stop. All right. So we, if you can believe it, have completed our first step of sewing all the way around our front and back pieces. Okay, so you can lift up your lever. And if your needle's still in there, like it is, I want you to turn the wheel. And just lift it out. Yep, perfect. And like I said before, we always want to make sure when we cut our thread, it touches the back of a table or the back surface of whatever you're working on. And now you can see your pieces are stuck together because we have sewn them. And have our little opening that we're going to be able to use in just a moment. All right, great job. Excellent job, Josie. You really were able to stay along your edges of your seam allowance. And now we're going to go ahead and just clean up some little threads on here. So we're going to snip that off just like so. Great. I'm going to take that. And the other thing we're going to do is we are going to clip the corners off of our fabric, okay? And that's going to help us when we turn the stuffy front and back to the right side to make it look really crisp. So I'm going to get these out of your way. Great. Okay. So even though our square doesn't look so square now, when we flip it, because our sewing lines are still square, it's going to turn out just fine. So we're going to go ahead and make the magic happen. All right? All right, Josie, the moment we've all been waiting for, we are going to turn our stuffy front and back to the right side, okay? So, yep, go ahead and reach inside the fabric. And just kind of, I'm just going to show everybody so they know what's happening. Just go ahead and pinch the top of the fabric so you get it in your hand. And then you're going to pull it back out the opening that you made at the bottom. So it's going to flip it. Just like if your clothing was inside out and you needed to turn it to the right side. Just kind of wiggle it a little bit. Sometimes that takes some practice. And what you're doing is great because you're taking your time with it. What you don't want to do is really struggle and pull because you don't want to break your seams. You don't want to rip them or else you'll have to sew again. All right, so you're turning, flipping it, And now it looks funny. It doesn't really look like anything. So what we need to do is really push out those corners. So what I like to take, you can take a pair of scissors or even your pen, and I like to push it into the corners. So just gently, yep, go ahead, head to the corners, the farthest corners away from you, and we're gonna start pushing them out. And this might take practice. Again, having an adult or someone to help you with that the first time might help you to really see and feel how it's supposed to be done. Okay? So, there you go. Alright, I'm going to borrow that for 1 second. I'm going to push my pen in there. And it's really, if you have a chopstick or anything that's just kind of pointy, is always helpful. We got that going that way. And I'm just gently kind of pushing it over into the corner. You see how it's getting a little more square? There you go. And the bottom, right down here. Okay. And our last side. And it's hard, your fingers are kind of rounded, so they don't have that pointy edge. That's why it's sometimes hard for you to use your fingers to go ahead and push out the corners. And it's okay if your pen or your scissors poke through a little bit. You don't want to poke so hard that it breaks the seam though. Okay? Alright. There she is. So we have our stuffy front. And flip it over. Our stuffy back. Right sides are both facing out. So we have officially made the body of our Fluffy Stuffy. Now we're going to go ahead and add the details. Alright, so we're going to bring back our good old pattern tissue to go ahead and figure out where we need to put our Fluffy Stuffy details. And the first thing we're going to do is take our ear piece. So I went back into my little Ziploc bag where I've kept all my details, and we're going to pull out the ear. And what we want to do is we want to match the ear piece up to the corners of the top of the Fluffy Stuffy. The top, as we know, is going to be the side that does not have the opening. So the bottom has the opening. The top does not. It is sewn together. So I'm going to line this up right here. And Josie, I'm going to have you grab your pen. And all I want you to do is make a line. And this is going to show us where we need to sew. Just following that edge, the long edge of the ear. Okay, we're going to go ahead and you see our line on there. And go ahead and switch it and do the same thing on the other side. Alright, our 2 ears are marked. So we're actually going to put this underneath the sewing machine, and we're going to run a line of stitches right where your marks are made. Okay, so Josie's back in the driver's seat over here, and we are going to top stitch along the lines we just drew to make our ears. And what the top stitch is going to do is create that definition of where the ear is located on our Fluffy Stuffy. And you'll notice that I have been using red thread. And normally you guys might choose a color that's closer to your actual fabric, but for today's purposes, so you can see it easily, we're going to use red thread so that you can actually see the thread when we're sewing. Most of the time you want to have the thread sort of hidden, so you want to pick a color that's closer to your fabric. Okay? All right, Josie, so we are going to set this up under your presser foot, which is already there. And we are not using a seam allowance this time. If you notice, we are actually right on top of the tape here. It doesn't look like we're going in any direction. That makes sense, but we're gonna follow that line all the way from the beginning to the end. So we are gonna make sure we backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, you ready? All right, go for it. And stop, and backstitch, push it down, and yep, perfect. Go forward. Onward. March. Why don't we stop right there, and you can do that back stitch again. And stop. And this time we're going to come right off the fabric, okay? And stop. All right. We're going to lift up the presser foot lever, and we're going to pull it out. Make sure it touches the back of the table. I have the scissors over here, so I'll go ahead and snip it. So now you can see, can Can you guys see this? That we have a line that has created the little corners of our ears. We're going to go ahead and do the same exact thing on the other side. We're just going to change the direction. So we want to come down this way. I'm going to have you move the wheel so the needle comes up out of the machine. Great. Perfect. Right back here. Presser foot's going to just be in line with the line you drew. And you're going to go ahead and stop and backstitch. And go forward. And a little further actually. And now backstitch. And stop and come forward. Excellent. We're going to lift up the presser foot lever, pull it out, and now we have 2 of our ears, which is all we need for our patterning. You take a look right on here. The 2 lines have been made. All right, now our Fluffy Stuffy is going to be able to live up to his name and become fluffy. We have our bin of Fluffy Stuffy food. It's also known as Polyfill. And what this is going to do is get smushed inside of our stuffy so it can be squishy, like a Fluffy Stuffy should be. So the first thing you want to do is grab some of the Polyfill. My recommendation is not to grab this much Polyfill. This will not go into that little opening that needs to go into the bottom. So just really grab about a handful, what you're comfortable with, not much more than that. And you're going to open up the bottom where we have our opening, and we're going to start to push it into our stuffy. And I sometimes like to use my scissors. So Josie, if you want to grab the scissors, if you're having a hard time trying to get, really want to make sure you fill it up from the furthest point away from you and let it come all the way back down. So I'm going to have you start taking some fluff and squishing it up. Just little handfuls here. Polyfill, you probably have more of a bag, but we just decided to break it down and put it in this little bucket here. Make it a little easier. There we go. Alright, and Josie's going to go to town and make this nice and squishy. Give it the official squish test when we're done. Alright, our Fluffy Stuffy's looking rather fluffy, Josie. And you can see he's kind of squishy. He's nice and filled up. He or she, if you will, or whatever you want it to be. The next step is you want to make sure your fluff is not going to fly out the bottom. So we will need to close it up. The important thing about closing up the bottom is to make sure your cut edges, so that's those frayed edges that when you were cutting are going to look a little messy. You want to make sure they tuck in. And the nice thing about when we sewed it, it will kind of automatically tuck in. So you can already see it facing in. And what we want to do is put some pins in place. I'm going to go ahead and grab our pins again. And I'm going to squeeze this. If you're finding that it's really hard to squeeze the bottom opening shut, that probably means you have too much fluff in there and you might need to take a little out. So don't be afraid to, you know, get a sense if you're struggling at all. And make sure you can, you know, move the fluff around a little bit so it's nice and evenly distributed throughout your fabric. So I'm squeezing it again. That feels a little bit better to me. And I want to make sure that the edges are going to meet up so that they're pretty close. And I'm going to pin about 1 inch away from the end so that I'm going to make sure I capture in all the opening so we can close it up. And we're going to pin a couple of pins just along the way. And this time it's a little easier. We don't have to do that whole pinching thing that we were doing before. All right. And so now I have about 4 pins along the end, closing it up, and we're going to come on over to the sewing machine and sew it shut. All right, Josie, we are set up underneath our sewing machine again. This is also a great time if you are sewing with another person. They can help you kind of squish this down a little bit to make it a little easier to get it underneath the machine. And Josie, I'm going to have you stop. We're going to take the pin out. And we're just going to run along the edge. This is a good point that we want to make. You want to run along the edge of the fabric, not use your seam allowance this time. You're going to keep the presser foot edge against the edge of our Fluffy Stuffy, okay? So that's not going to line up with your tape for your seam allowance, okay? All right, go ahead, Josie. And we're just going to help guide it right on through and stop. We're going to take our pin out. Go. And stop. And we're going to go ahead and come down a little further and stop. And now we want to make sure we get our back stitch in. Okay? And stop. And come forward. Great. And you also want to make sure you have a back stitch in the beginning as well. So it's always at the beginning and the end when you top stitch the opening shut. So it looks like our Fluffy Stuffy, all the stuffing has been contained inside of our Stuffy here. Great job. And he's looking like he's coming together a little bit better. And he just needs to get a cute little face, right? Okay. Okay, Josie, we are going to make our Fluffy Stuffy really cute. We got back out all of our detail pieces that we're going to put onto our fabric. So we also brought back out our pattern tissue to show us where those detail pieces are supposed to go. So I'm using this as a guide. It doesn't necessarily have to be the way you want to set it up. You can be creative about your layout of how you want your pieces to be. So I think what we're going to do is take a look at our guide sheet. We do have a recommendation about how we glue things down, but at least for laying out purposes, you can just go ahead and take your pieces. I'm going to take our ear piece, and you can even pin it down to where you think you want it to be. And the nice thing is that, let's say we want to take our eye piece. This is when we're going to start removing the pattern tissue and putting it onto our fabric. Once we do that, don't worry, he doesn't feel anything yet. You can actually just place a pin in there to hold it in place so that it doesn't move around on you when you're shuffling your pieces around. I'm also going to remove our tape at this point since we kind of know where the front and the back is going to be. All right, so we're done with the tape. And Josie, why don't we go ahead and grab your ear and we can start laying it out and deciding where we want our pieces to go, okay? Awesome, Josie. This Fluffy Stuffy is looking super adorable. And now we need to make sure, obviously you don't want to squeeze a Fluffy Stuffy with a bunch of pins in it. So we are going to take our glue. This is pretty standard craft glue. You can buy it at almost any craft store like we mentioned on your supply list. And the key with craft glue is a little dabble do ya. What often happens is people saturate, like they really get their fabric way too wet. And it takes a long time for it to dry and it just ends up falling off. So it's really about getting those fibers, a little bit of glue on each side and sticking it down and leaving it alone and letting it dry. Okay? There's an art to gluing. So we're going to start with our ears. That's our recommendation. We're going to go ahead and unpin one side. And just do one section at a time. So Josie, I'm going to have you just put a little glue on the ear and then a little glue on the outer ear section, okay? Just cover that up. I'll hold that out. And just kind of like move it around a little bit. There you go. Excellent. Let's stop right there. And why don't we put a little glue on this side? Just follow that triangle shape. Maybe come into the middle a little bit. Make some designs. Perfect. Okay. So now we're going to take this piece and just kind of gently stick it on there. Great. I'm just gonna, yep, you got it. A little squeeze. So now we're gonna go ahead and do the inner ear part. And the key is don't squeeze it too much because it's just gonna squish right back into the fabric. And put a little glue where you want it to go on here. Bravo. All right, we're going to move on to the next ear. Okay, we're going to give our Fluffy Stuffy an inspection. Make sure our friend is ready for the big show. And check around, make sure there's no loose threads. We also want to make sure everything's glued down pretty well. You might want to leave it to sit for a little while so that anything that's not dry doesn't actually fall off. And I think we're looking pretty good, my dear. And here he is. We have our Fluffy Stuffy. You did an amazing job. So, the moral of the story is, one step at a time. You guys did an amazing job going through this journey with us to learn how to sew your Fluffy Stuffy. And we're really excited that you made it to the end. I know there's a lot of steps in the process, and we're excited to see what kind of projects you guys have made. So if you'd like to share it, go ahead to our social media sites. We have thehandworkstudio.com. We're also on Facebook at The Handwork Studio, and we're on Instagram at Handwork Studio. So we'd love to see all the hard work you've done, and we're excited to show you more of our patterns coming out in the next year. Thanks so much.